All right. Mark Nix from National Right to Work joins us right now. Mark, hey, thanks for being on the show. I think it's the first time you've been on the show since the new year, so it's good to chat with you again here. Okay, so the election season, crazy season already in place. Not a big question that the union money, and I'm being real careful how I'm saying this, Mark. The union money, the union bosses, they're all in, for the left on the Democratic side, regardless of what the workers themselves are actually wanting. But in order for them to maintain that leverage of power, they need the numbers involved, and that involves, the policy of people being able to opt out or opt into unions. So that's why it sounds like a lot of the union and the labor policy the Biden administration is pushing is in place because they've got to, I guess, scratch the back of the union bosses if they want their back scratched with, the campaign donations and everything that goes with it. I don't mean to make it that simplistic, but that's kind of the basic synopsis, isn't it?
Well, it is, and good morning to you, Mike and Gabe and Stell. Good to be with you. Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, it's always election season, though, Mike. It never ceases, and there's always politics involved in everything. And this time, to your point, I mean, the Biden administration has clearly put their thumb on the scale in favor of union officials, not necessarily rank and file workers. In fact, we got some interesting news just over the weekend about his kind of pulling back on the EV transition, the electric vehicle transition, that is really a big problem for auto workers across the country, particularly at the little three, GM, Ford, and Stellantis. I mean, they admit that 40% less labor is needed to build EVs, and the Biden administration comes out with this mandate that's saying, it's got to be 60% EV production by 2030. Well, over the weekend, the New York Times and the Washington Post report that they're kind of pulling back because they're worried, to your point, Mike, that the auto workers are pretty nervous about this guy, and notwithstanding the fact that the United Auto Workers Union, 14 executive committee members, including Sean Fain, the new president, endorsed Joe Biden. And after that endorsement, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, he went on the air and said, let me be clear, a great majority of our workers are not going to be voting for Biden. So you figure out what that means.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I was going to touch on, Mark, is the idea that there's become a much larger separation, I think, between the leadership and the rank and file in terms of the labor movement of late, and I'm wondering how that's affecting the legislative efforts now to stop the requirement for union membership.
Yeah, I mean, so basically, let me tack on to that is okay. So is the left, the politicians, going to listen to the bosses or the workers?
Well, the politicians, Gabe, that's a great point, and the politicians will listen to the union officials because they're the one that control the money, unfortunately. I mean, rank and file workers, really, one of the major obstacles of compulsory unionism is that forced political conformity that comes with being forced to pay dues or fees to a union in order to get or keep a job. That money obviously is fungible. A lot of it translates into politics. In fact, every 2 years we do a study of what the union officials themselves report what they spend on politics and lobbying. It's over $2 billion. Now, if you calculate that based on some other views, like the view of the United States Supreme Court saying that everything that government unions do is political, so every penny they spend is designed to redress government and affect public policy, then you get to $10 billion to $12 billion every year, every 2 years on politics. And, we hear about the Soroses and the Kochs and the Zuckerbergs and all those folks. Those guys are pikers compared to the billions that organized labor has to spend to keep their privilege and to keep their power. And that means most politicians side with the union officials and not with rank and file workers.
Hey, good morning, Mark. Stal Ponticus here. So we saw labor agreements a few months ago that included some big pay raises, and then the layoffs began. And I've heard folks comments from Wall Street about, well, you know what? The stock market is way up. Well, you know what? The stock market loves companies that lay off people because then the profits wind up showing up. So where do the companies go from here? Because it seems like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Well, I hope they maintain themselves, but you're right. I mean, UPS is laying off workers. The little three are laying off workers. GM's announcing some stuff, a slowdown in the electric vehicle production. But, one of the things, Stel, that's really important about this so-called historic agreement, when you look at the non-union automobile workers in the right-to-work states, in Tennessee and North Carolina and Alabama and Mississippi and South Carolina. The top wages for those workers, the non-union workers, is about $35.32 an hour. The wage now with the new UAW contract for all UAW represented workers is only about $32.32 an hour with the quote-unquote historic contract. And when you take out union dues, you're down to about $31 an hour for unionized automobile workers. So there's one thing we know about employers that go to right-to-work states to produce automobiles and produce tires and produce airplanes is they take care of their employees for the most part. And if they don't, nothing stops those workers from organizing and unionizing. But up to now, none of those big companies have done it. And that's why the Biden administration, to Mike, back to your point, is putting the thumb on the scale using federal tax dollars, whether it be incentivizing battery plants or saying to automobile manufacturers, if you want to get any of the money that federal government's handing out, you probably should be neutral in your stance toward unions, or you should disagree to a card check unionization when the union tells you they have a majority. So the administration's working overtime. I don't know if they get paid time and a half, but they're working overtime to make sure that they can deliver, rank and file workers and certainly the union officials' money come November.
Yeah, one of my baseball teammates is actually getting screwed by the UPS layoff and the union restrictions on him. So they laid him off, but then they said, well, you can make money by working this ridiculous shift in order to take some leftover. He was explaining it to us, and there are things he's not allowed to do to go work for somebody else because it's a violation of the union rules. So much of it has to do with control of the workers, but they have to pay into it. We're visiting with Mark Mix from National Right to Work. Okay, so where do we go from here? I mean, obviously, elections matter. Elections have consequences. But if you're a worker, you're in one of these unions, and you just hear the union boss say, yeah, we know that maybe a majority of our workers disagree with us, but this is what we're doing anyway. Do you have any recourse whatsoever?
Yeah, you do, but it's not easy. I mean, if you're a public sector worker, a government worker, you have complete recourse. We won that Janus decision. I think we all talked about that a while back in 2018, that basically said no government worker anywhere in America can be forced to pay dues or fees to a union to get or keep a job and work for government. On the private sector side, though, Mike, it's a little more difficult. We won a Supreme Court case back in 1998 called the Beck decision, which basically said that if you're a private sector worker, you can object to the political spending, but in order to do that, you have to resign union membership. You're still forced to pay fees to keep your job in a non-right-to-work state, but you give up your right to vote on your contract. You give up the right to vote on union elections. You give up the right to reform the union from the inside. You have to basically say, I give up all of my workplace rights to protect my political rights. And in order to protect my workplace rights, I have to give up my political rights. And so that's kind of the conundrum or the Hobson's choice that workers are faced with in the private sector. There is relief, but it comes with a price, and that price is a price that no individual that's forced to associate with someone should be forced to pay. But unfortunately, that's the law, and until we can change that in the United States Congress, workers are still going to be faced with that decision. Do I let them use my money for political causes I oppose and give up my workplace rights, or do I protect my workplace rights and give up my political rights and my ideological rights? It's a choice no one should have to make.
Okay, so is this just a federal issue, Mark, or is this something that needs to be layered with state laws as well?
Well, the Janus decision covers everybody across the country. So no government worker, whether it be in Missouri or California or New York or Maine or wherever, can be compelled to pay dues or fees to a union at all. In the private sector, obviously, if you're in one of the 26 right-to-work states, you can't be compelled to pay dues or fees to the union. But in Missouri and the 23 other non-right-to-work states, you have to make that choice between, your workplace rights and your political rights, your ideological rights. And so we can solve that legislatively. Obviously, when the Supreme Court ruled in Janus that no worker, that the public sector workers have constitutional First Amendment rights when it comes to issues like these, we think that private sector workers should have the same constitutional First Amendment rights. But I think the court's going to say, look, the statute is there. This law was passed back in the 1930s, and until the Congress does something about it, we would let it stand at this point where workers are continued to force to pay dues or fees to get or keep a job in America. It's wrong. It's always been wrong. It's public opinions against it. Most rank and file workers oppose it, but union officials, they enjoy it, and that's why they have to spend so much on politics to protect that type of privilege.
So, Mark, any thoughts from you regarding California Senator Barbara Lee, who wants $50 an hour minimum wage?
That's funny you mentioned that. I was on C-SPAN, Washington Journal, one day, and I was debating against a union official, and somebody called in from California. They said, look, I want you two just to shut up and listen to this question. If you could wave a wand, what would you make the minimum wage? And so, interestingly enough, the C-SPAN guy went to the union guy first, and he took out a slide rule and started doing calculations. Stel, I know you know what a slide rule is. I do too.
I do too.
He took out a slide rule and he came up with this $8.68 an hour should be the minimum wage. This was way back when. And I said, how about $25 an hour? And it's like there was this guffaws across the board. And they were like, how dare you? That's ridiculous. It's absurd. I said, no. If your point is that you can set a wage that will get people out of poverty, why not make it 25 and get it over with? It's basic economics 101. And Barbara Lee, my goodness, does she really believe that? Does she think that works? Is that like Guam tipping over on one side of the island? I'm not sure. Sorry. I'm just sorry. Gabe, $50 an hour. They don't understand.
Right.
Yeah, they can't do math. There ought to be a math test. I'm not with the cognitive test, but I think they ought to be able to pass a math test and a basic economics test before serving.
You know what? If we want everybody to be millionaires, let's just go ahead and set the minimum wage at about $250 an hour.
There you go. Problem solved.
Exactly. Why not? Yeah. If it works, just do it. And I that kind of debate is it's not worthy really of any attention except for the fact that people need to understand that. And sure, look, we want employees to be successful, and if they think they can do that by amplifying their voice in a union, then have at it. Federal law protects that every day, every way. And so what we need to do is we need to continue to expose union officials like Sean Fain, who literally said, I don't know if it was a Keynesian slip, a Kingsley gaffe,
Freudian,
whatever those things are. Yeah. When he says a great majority of our workers are not going to vote for Joe Biden. I mean, maybe he knows that. And we know that in polls, exit polls after elections, that there is a large chunk, sometimes up to 45% of rank and file workers who will admit in post-election polls saying, yeah, I voted for against the guy that my union endorsed. And that happens a lot more than we know.
All right. Mark Mix, National Right to Work. What's the website, social media people should check you out at?
Yeah, nrtw.org, nrtw.org, or if legislation is their interest, nrtwc.org, nrtwc.org.
All right, Mark Mix, National Right to Work. Hey, thanks again, Mark. Good to talk to you again.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.